The outside temperature had climbed past 105 degrees for the third day in a row. At the receiving bay, 2 scheduled trucks waited under the covered lane. Farmers at 3 other farms had delayed loading and were waiting for Jordan's clearance. Then Roy Maddox pulled in, off schedule, with a truck he hadn't called ahead about. His refrigerated unit, the reefer, had stopped holding temperature somewhere on the highway. Inside the cold room, the display still read close to normal. The room normally held at 45 degrees. The warmest sensor now showed 46. 1 more degree would trigger an intake shutdown under Jordan's own operating plan. Roy looked past Jordan at the open floor space near the back wall. The temperature inside his truck had been rising mile by mile the whole drive over. There's room. You can see there's room. Jordan didn't move toward the door. There's floor space. There isn't cooling capacity. Roy offered triple the normal rate, right there in the heat. Jordan didn't open the door. 3 months earlier, none of this had a name yet. Jordan Hayes was 17 years old. He lived with his mother on a small vegetable farm in East Texas. The Hayes family had grown and sold vegetables in this county for generations. Like a lot of small farms, they didn't have the volume to justify their own refrigerated truck. They couldn't afford a commercial cold room either, not on their own. They could grow good produce. That part had never been the problem. The problem showed up after the harvest, in the hours nobody could control. One morning, the family cut a full load of green beans before sunrise. The pickup truck that was supposed to collect them ran hours behind schedule. The beans sat in the field heat while everyone waited by the gate. By the time the truck finally arrived, some of the beans had gone soft. The buyer downgraded the load on the spot, without much discussion. Monique had to sell it for less than half of what she'd expected. She stood at the kitchen table that night, going over the numbers twice. We didn't lose it in the field, we lost it in the hours after. Jordan didn't say much back. He just wrote the sentence down on a scrap of paper. He kept that paper on the dashboard of the truck for weeks after that. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and everyone in the family knew it. A season earlier, a load of peppers had sat too long in the heat before pickup. The buyer had walked the crates slowly, picking through them one at a time. He'd rejected almost a third of the load without raising his voice about it. Monique hadn't argued. There wasn't much to argue about once the heat had already done its work. Jordan had watched that whole exchange from the edge of the truck bed, saying nothing. He started paying closer attention to the clock after that, more than the weather. About 6 miles from the farm sat an old dairy collection station, closed for 9 years. The milk processing line had been stripped out and sold off long before, but one small cold room was still standing, mostly intact. It had insulated walls, a sealed door, and a drained floor. An old cooling coil still hung from the ceiling, dusty but unbroken. Outside, a covered receiving area faced the old loading lane. A scrap buyer walking through only saw stainless steel, copper pipe, and an old compressor worth selling for parts. Jordan saw something else. He saw insulation that still held, a door that still sealed, a floor that still drained. He stood in the doorway a long time before he said anything to the man beside him. The dust on the old coil didn't bother him. Dust could be cleaned. Insulation that had failed could not. That room hasn't held anything cold in 9 years. Jordan answered without looking up from the door hinge. The insulation doesn't know how long the power's been off. Monique didn't buy the whole building, and she made that clear from the start. She bought some of the equipment still sitting inside and signed a lease for one approved section. Monique formed the business in her own name. She signed the lease, bought the insurance, and approved every storage agreement that followed. Jordan helped build and manage the system, but he did not legally operate the business alone. Evelyn Ross was the local food facility inspector, assigned to review the approved section. She walked the space before any restoration work began, checking the old dairy line first. She stopped in front of the sealed processing room and shook her head once. None of that is part of any approval I'd signed my name to. She laid out the limits plainly, standing in the doorway of the old cold room. No milk or dairy products could be received under the new lease. The old processing line stayed closed permanently. Nothing outside the approved section could be used for the business, and nothing could be received at all until the inspection was complete. She asked Jordan a string of questions about sanitation and record keeping. Where would rejected loads go? How would spoiled produce be kept apart from good product? Who signed the daily log? He didn't have every answer ready that first day, and he said so plainly. Evelyn told him that was fine, as long as the answers came before the produce did. She came back twice more over the following month, checking the same details each time. By her third visit, she signed off without much comment, which felt like a kind of trust. Jordan had not reopened the dairy. His mother had leased one approved section of the old milk station and restored a single cold room. At first, Jordan's plan was bigger than what the room could actually hold. He wanted to take in any kind of produce that showed up at the door. He wanted to charge by the pallet and fill every marked position. He wanted the doors open whenever a truck happened to roll in. Monique stopped him before the drawings went any further. She asked him a short list of questions, one at a time, at the kitchen table. What temperature did each crop actually need? How much heat had to come out of it, and how fast? What happened if a load showed up too hot? What happened if the power went out? What happened if 3 trucks arrived at once? Jordan didn't have good answers yet, and he knew it. He spent the next few days calling around to farms he barely knew, just to ask questions. Some of those calls went nowhere. A few people just laughed and hung up on him politely. One farmer told him flatly that a room without rules was just an expensive way to lose produce slower. Another asked him what would happen if 2 different crops needed opposite conditions at once. Jordan didn't have an answer for that one either, not yet. He started keeping his own notebook, jotting down every answer and every open question as it came up. Clara Benton grew green beans and bell peppers a few miles down the road. She came by early, before anyone else had signed anything. She listened to Jordan's plan, then said the thing that reset it. Farmers don't need a room that is sometimes cold. They need to know what happened to every box after it crossed that door. Jordan understood that the room could not replace every pre-cooling process a crop might need. It could only protect certain products, prepared the right way. Within a narrow window, Monique hired David Cole, a licensed refrigeration contractor, to inspect the old system. David would supervise every repair involving the cooling equipment itself. Jordan could clean, measure, and help with the layout. He could not open the refrigerant circuit or perform certified electrical work. Jordan's uncle, Leon Hayes, had spent years maintaining farm equipment before he retired. He could guide ordinary mechanical work and help monitor the room. Refrigeration and high-voltage work still belonged to certified contractors, not to him. A certified electrician inspected the old panel and isolated every circuit outside the leased section. David tested the compressor, the evaporator fans, and the controls one at a time. Anything involving refrigerant stayed in his hands alone. Jordan helped with cleaning, airflow measurements, shelving, and the paper records. The cleanup work that followed took weeks, and most of it wasn't dramatic. Scraping old grease off the shelving, resealing the drain in the floor, patching a section of wall where insulation had crumbled with age. None of that made for much of a story on its own. But 3 specific failures nearly stopped the project before it started. The first came a few days after the compressor finally ran clean under David's supervision. David walked the room with a handheld thermometer, checking corner by corner. One corner stayed warmer than the rest, no matter how long the unit ran. Old shelving was blocking the airflow near the back wall. A single sensor near the door wasn't reading the whole room at all. David rebuilt the shelving layout and added several more sensor points around the space. Leon watched from the doorway during most of that work, arms crossed, saying little. Once the new layout was finished, he ran his hand along the shelf edge and nodded. Now it looks like it might actually hold something. The second failure showed up on the electric bill, not in the room itself. The door gasket had worn thin, and the door was opening far too often. Cold air was leaking out every time someone walked through without thinking about it. They replaced the gasket. They hung a plastic strip curtain across the frame. They built a strict intake schedule and started logging every door, opening by hand. The third failure was the one that reshaped the whole plan. A trial load, cut fresh that same morning, pushed the room's temperature up fast. Jordan realized cold storage and pre-cooling were not the same thing at all. A cold room could hold a temperature. It couldn't pull heat out of a hot crop by itself. David designed a small forced air zone to solve exactly that problem. It could handle 2 pallets at a time, no more. Fans and cover panels would pull cold air straight through the vents in the boxes. The refrigerant circuit itself would stay untouched, exactly as it was. Pre-cooling capacity, not floor space, became the real limit on the whole system. Jordan stood in the doorway that evening, looking at the 2 marked forced air positions. He'd wanted the whole room to feel like one big answer to the family's problem. Instead, it was starting to feel like a much smaller, much more specific tool. David told him that was usually how it worked, whether people liked it or not. After the third failure, the money started running thin fast. The loan Monique had taken out was close to its limit. The electric bill had come in higher than anyone had planned for. Only 2 crops had cleared testing in time for the first season. The second cold room in the building stayed locked, off the table entirely. A few farmers who'd shown early interest backed out, put off by how strict the rules had become. Jordan offered to sell the spare compressor and the leftover copper piping. Monique didn't answer right away. She set the empty crate from that downgraded shipment on the table. Then she placed the buyer's old receipt beside it. The beans were long gone. The loss was still written clearly on the page. Are you trying to fill the room or protect what goes inside it? Jordan sat with that question for a long moment before he spoke. He changed the plan that night, right there at the table. The room had 24 marked positions. Jordan limited regular storage to 18 of them. 2 positions were reserved permanently for the forced air zone. 4 more stayed open for airflow, inspection, and anything unexpected. Clara helped him turn that plan into something that could actually be checked. She sat with him one evening and sketched out a full process, step by step. They worked through it slowly, crossing out steps that sounded good but wouldn't hold up under pressure. At one point, Clara stopped and asked him what would happen if 2 trucks arrived with the same lot code by mistake. Jordan hadn't thought of that. He added a check for it right there, on the spot. Customers would register their harvest time and their expected arrival time in advance. Every lot would get its own code, tied to one farm and one harvest window. Harvest time would be logged before the truck ever left the field. Box type would be checked at the door every single time. Intake temperature would be measured and recorded before anything moved inside. Each forced air cycle would be tracked from start to finish. Pallet position would be logged the moment it entered storage. Temperature would be tracked continuously for as long as the pallet stayed inside. Outbound temperature would be recorded again at pickup, and every customer would leave with a receipt showing the whole history of their load. Clara insisted on one more thing before she signed anything herself. If a buyer ever questions a lot, the paperwork should answer for it, not us. Jordan wrote that line at the top of the log sheet template and left it there all season. The limits were locked in alongside the process, and nobody was allowed to bend them. 18 storage positions, 2 forced air positions, 4 positions held in reserve, 2 pallets per forced air cycle, never more. No load accepted above the intake temperature limit, no load accepted in the wrong kind of box. Before the heat arrived, Monique arranged for a generator and had it tested under real load. An electrician confirmed the starting power the compressor would actually need, then ran the whole system under that load before anyone trusted it. The generator was wired to cover exactly 4 things, nothing beyond that. The approved cooling system, the forced air fans, when they were running, the temperature logging equipment, and a minimum set of safety lights. It would not power the rest of the building, not under any circumstance. Monique logged the backup fuel supply herself and wrote the transfer procedure down step by step. Clara brought the first real test load once the process was finally in place. 1 pallet of green beans, 1 pallet of bell peppers, both packed in the approved ventilated boxes they'd tested weeks earlier. Clara stood near the door, arms crossed, watching Jordan work without saying much. Jordan logged the lot code, the harvest time, and the intake temperature by hand. He started the forced air cycle and noted the exact time on the sheet. The first run didn't hit its target. The boxes had been stacked too close together. Cold air couldn't move freely through the stacks. The centers of both pallets remained warmer than the target. They restacked the load with gaps between the boxes and tried again. No new equipment failure showed up this time, only a packing mistake they could fix by hand. Clara let out a breath she'd apparently been holding and allowed herself a small smile. On the second run, air moved cleanly through both pallets. Their sampled temperatures followed the cooling curve David had calculated for the trial. Both pallets moved into storage after reaching the target range. The data went into the file right alongside the printed receipt. Clara became the first customer of the whole operation. A few days later, she picked up her produce and watched the buyer inspect it. The buyer checked it over, tested a sample, and accepted the load without hesitation. Word moved quickly after that. 2 more farms signed on within the week once they'd seen Clara's results for themselves. One of them was an older couple who grew peppers on just under 10 acres. They asked Jordan a dozen questions before they'd sign, most of them about what happened if their load got rejected. Jordan walked them through the whole process twice, slowly, until they seemed satisfied. The second was a younger farmer named Isaac, who mostly wanted to know how fast he could get in and out. Jordan told him the schedule wasn't built for speed, it was built for consistency. Isaac signed anyway, and admitted later that consistency was worth more to him than speed ever had been. Jordan turned away 1 load of sweet corn that same week, without much debate. Corn needed its own separate cooling process, one the room hadn't been built to handle. He explained it to the farmer standing at the gate as plainly as he could. The farmer wasn't happy, but he understood the reason once Jordan laid it out. Monique placed the first 3 customer files in a drawer she kept just for that purpose. The generator was tested once more before the heat arrived, just to be sure. A shift schedule went up on the wall of the station house. Jordan would never run a shift alone, not once, not for any reason. Monique or Leon would always be present when Jordan was on duty. Monique would manage the generator herself whenever it came into play. Jordan would manage the data and the intake schedule. If the status board ever showed a technical fault, they would call David directly. The forecast that week showed 3 straight days above 105 degrees. Jordan locked the season's capacity right there and refused any new contracts outside the schedule. On the first day of the heat, farms harvested well before dawn, exactly as planned. Headlights moved across the fields at 4 in the morning, cutting beans and peppers before the sun came up. Only 2 trucks were allowed at the receiving bay at any one time. Jordan sampled the intake temperature of every lot using the approved method. He recorded the warmest verified reading before the load entered the forced air zone. He rejected any lot whose verified sample exceeded the intake limit. One farmer pushed back because his sampled reading was only a couple of degrees over. Jordan held the line anyway and explained why the limit existed instead of just repeating the rule. The farmer didn't love the answer, but he came back the next morning with a cooler load. He ran each forced air cycle fully before moving anything into storage. He kept the door closed between deliveries every single time. By the end of that first day, the room was still holding inside its target range. The compressor had been running longer than usual, almost without pause. The heat buffer they'd built into the schedule had shrunk down noticeably. Jordan canceled 1 late-day intake window just to protect what was already inside. Nobody argued with the decision. Everyone understood what was at stake. That night, Leon sat with him outside the station house, both of them too tired to talk much. Leon finally said the compressor sounded like it was working harder than it should have to. Jordan agreed. but there wasn't anything to do about it except watch the numbers. They took turns checking the display every half hour until well past midnight. On the second day, the power grid failed without warning. The compressor stopped mid-cycle. Monique and Leon were both already there with Jordan when it happened. Nobody opened the door, not even to check on anything by eye. Monique ran the transfer procedure exactly the way they'd tested it weeks before. The generator started under the correct load. It powered the refrigeration system, the monitoring equipment, and the minimum safety lights. The forced air fans stayed off because every new intake had been postponed. Nothing else in the buildings received power. Jordan tracked the temperature using a battery-powered reader, watching it closely. Grid power didn't come back as quickly as anyone had hoped. The backup fuel supply kept dropping, hour by hour. Monique postponed every new intake for the rest of that day. Farms that hadn't started harvesting delayed their crews. Produce already picked stayed in shaded on-farm staging areas until Jordan confirmed another opening. Clara called twice that afternoon just to check on the room, not to push for anything. Jordan told her the truth both times, holding steady but nowhere near comfortable. She told him to call her the moment anything changed, and then let him go. Grid power finally came back late that night, hours after anyone had stopped expecting it soon. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, the lights in the station house flickered and steadied. Monique ran the transfer procedure in reverse, just as carefully as she had the first time. The compressor picked back up where it had left off, and the room began to recover. That brings the story back to the third day, and the moment it started with. 2 scheduled trucks sat waiting under the covered lane. Roy Maddox showed up off schedule, his reefer truck no longer holding temperature. He climbed down from the cab looking like a man who'd already run through every other option. The room still had open floor space near the back wall, but the forced air zone already held 2 pallets, its full limit for the cycle. The compressor was running almost without pause. The room still sat at 45 degrees on a normal day. Today, the warmest sensor read 46. 1 more degree would trigger the intake shutdown Jordan had written into his own plan. 47 degrees did not mean the produce instantly became unsafe. It meant the room no longer had enough thermal margin to accept another warm load. There's room. You can see there's room. There's floor space. There isn't cooling capacity. Roy offered triple pay, right there in front of both trucks. It was the kind of money that could have covered a real share of what the family still owed. Jordan didn't open the door for the whole load. He didn't turn his back on Roy either. Jordan offered no reserved slot. He told Roy that 1 small portion could be reconsidered only after every scheduled load had cleared the forced air zone and the room returned to target. Until then, Roy had no promise from Jordan. Together, they worked out which part of Roy's shipment was most at risk. They reached a driver from another farm who was already heading back from the market with an empty reefer. They split the load by where it still needed to go. Roy accepted the plan without pushing further. He stood by his truck for a moment, looking back at the covered receiving bay. You could have just said yes and made this my problem to worry about later. Jordan shook his head. Then it would have been somebody else's problem instead. Not fair either way. Roy didn't have an answer for that, and he didn't need one. Jordan had turned down a large payday to protect commitments he'd already made. After Roy's truck pulled away, the warmest sensor kept climbing toward the shutdown line. Jordan and Leon didn't touch the refrigerant system, and they didn't adjust any pressure settings. Both of them knew exactly where that line sat, and neither one considered crossing it, even under pressure. They checked the approved status board first. They checked the compressor's run cycle. They checked the door log for anything unusual. They compared the readings across every sensor in the room. They pulled up the pallet position map, looking for a pattern. Jordan traced his finger along the printed layout, checking each square against the last known reading. Leon stood over his shoulder, quiet, letting him work through it without interrupting. The data pointed toward one spot, near the return air gap at the back of the room. During the final scheduled intake before the grid failed, One pallet had stopped a few inches short of its marked line. The forklift driver hadn't noticed the narrowed gap behind it in the rush. Jordan had logged the lot code correctly, but skipped checking the return air gap. Everyone had been tired. It was a small mistake, made under real pressure. Jordan didn't try to explain it away when Leon asked him about it. "I saw the gap. I just didn't stop to check it. I should have." Leon didn't scold him for it. He just told him to say so out loud next time, before it became a habit. They stopped all intake completely. They planned a single door opening, no more than that. They prepared the correct position in advance, before touching the door at all. They opened the door. They moved exactly one pallet back into its proper place. They logged the exact time the door had been open. They closed it immediately after. The temperature didn't drop right away. They watched it through one more full cycle without touching anything else. Slowly, the sensor eased back down from the edge of the shutdown line. If the status board had shown any fault code, they would have called David immediately. Neither Jordan nor Leon opened the cooling system themselves, not for a second. The next morning, the buyer's trucks arrived on schedule. Every committed lot was checked against its lot code and its printed receipt. Intake and outbound times were compared side by side. The full temperature record was reviewed for each pallet in turn. Storage positions were confirmed against the log. The buyer inspected the produce by eye, checked the condition of the boxes, and pulled samples to test. Every committed lot was accepted. Jordan watched the last truck pull away from the receiving bay before he let himself relax at all. The room had not made bad produce good. It had kept good produce within the agreed time and temperature limits. Clara stood near her own pallets while the buyer worked, watching the same way she had the first time. When the last box was checked and cleared, she looked over at Jordan and just nodded once. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much left to say that the paperwork hadn't already said. The buyer's truck pulled out of the lot and turned onto the county road. In the days after the heat wave passed, the family settled into a quieter rhythm. They paid down part of the loan. 3 farms agreed to split the ongoing cost of electricity and maintenance going forward. A shared generator fund was set up, so no single family would carry that cost alone. Isaac stopped by one afternoon just to see the room running normally, without any crisis attached to it. He told Jordan the quiet days were almost stranger to watch than the chaotic ones had been. Jordan laughed at that, the first time he'd laughed about any of it in weeks. Roy signed up for reserved backup capacity ahead of next season, without any hard feelings between them. The backup block was scheduled in advance, and it could never override a confirmed customer slot. He told Monique once, almost in passing, that he respected being told no more than being told a comfortable lie. The second cold room in the building stayed locked, exactly as it had been from the start. Jordan still never ran a shift alone. Monique sat across from him one evening the same way she had months before. We didn't lose it in the field, we lost it in the hours after. Jordan looked up from the log sheet before he answered her. Then those hours are what we're selling. The old milk station did not save every crop from the heat. Jordan restored one room, protected the limits of that room, and gave small farms more control over the hours after a good harvest. None of it had come from a bigger building, a bigger loan, or a bigger promise than the family could keep. It had come from one room, used exactly the way it was meant to be used, every single time. 9 years of silence in that building had ended with something smaller than anyone first imagined, and steadier for it. The cold room door closed for the night. The display held steady at 45 degrees. Jordan stood outside the old milk station in the evening light, looking at a building that had finally earned its keep again.